Good afternoon and good evening, depending where you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us for the Peoplehood Papers virtual event, Stories for Good. This event is sponsored by AGWS, the Center for Jewish Peoplehood Education, Gabriel Project Mumbai, JDC Entwine, Kivunim, Olam, and Repair the World. My name is Amy Weiss, and I'm the Director of Jewish Communal Engagement and Learning at Olam, coming to you live from a very rainy day in Washington, D.C. I'm so excited that our speakers and our audience is coming in from around the world. Feel free in the chat to put where you are calling in from. The Peoplehood Papers is commissioned by the Center for Jewish Peoplehood Education. This year is its 29th volume and asks the question, a 21st century peoplehood with Tikkun Olam at its heart. What does it mean and how is it done? A special thank you to Shlomi Ravid, Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Peoplehood, for spearheading the publication of the Peoplehood Papers. In the last few decades, we have been witnessing a significant rise in the Jewish public's interest in the notion of Tikkun Olam. The shift in focus from catering to good for the Jews to seeking to bring justice and help to communities in need, coupled with the call to personally serve that cause, represents no less than a paradigm shift in the Jewish ethos. Today, we are excited to experiment with a new virtual format, not your typical panel or discussion, but a story hour that will bring you 8 vignettes from not only contributors to the Peoplehood Papers, but Jewish leaders at the forefront of the Jewish community and justice around the world. A quick note on technology. The chat function is enabled, and feel free to share your responses or ideas with one another in the chat as you hear the stories. We will also be asking you to share some reflections throughout the event. Lastly, we'll be sharing each speaker's full bio in the chat as they begin their story. So sit back, relax, and get ready to be inspired from these incredible Jewish leaders on what Tikkun Olam means to them and why. Without further ado, on to our first story. Lilach Shafir is the Director of International Education and Jewish Engagement at American Jewish World Service. There, she leads a team of educators and activists who engage Jewish leaders and clergy for human rights. Her essay in the publication is entitled Tikkun Olam in a Pandemic and Beyond, Acting Together Globally. It is my honor to now pass the mic to Lilach Shafir.
Thank you so much, Amy, and really a pleasure to be here and to share a bit of my own story with these other incredible panelists. So 20 years ago, I was sitting in a hot and dusty university classroom in Tucson, Arizona. My professor was standing on a chair in the middle of a heated lecture on US interventionism. And on this day, he was focused on a half-island nation just east of Indonesia called East Timor. In 1974, Portugal gave up most of its colonies around the world, he told us, including this country of just 1 million people. The Timorese thought they had newfound independence, but with heavy US support, the Indonesians invaded and occupied East Timor for 2.5 decades, killing a quarter of the population. This finally ended when the Timorese came to a vote for a full democracy in 1999. Okay, at this point, you're probably wondering, what does this all have to do with my view on Tikkun Olam and peoplehood? Decades ago, I had this gravitational pull within me, a force that I wanted to go to East Timor, to see it and understand it, especially as a new democracy that began in 2002. I was raised in Phoenix, Arizona, just near the border with Sonora, Mexico, with a US-born mother and an Israeli father. We had Hebrew around us at home. I learned Spanish in school, and then Portuguese while living in Brazil. And with my parents and so many other influences, I also learned that my existence as a privileged Jew was about so much more than just myself. And in my career, I've been learning about the importance of partnership and humility, chavruta and anava. I did move to Dili, East Timor in 2006, and I spent 3 years there. I quickly learned the other national language of Tetin, and while speaking both Tetin and Portuguese, I was offered opportunities I really shouldn't have in my 20s. I was leading national level strategic plans, and I was meeting regularly with the prime minister of the country. And there was something within me that just didn't feel right about this whole international development operation, the alphabet soup of NGOs. The people from the global north who arrived to capacity build those in the global south while they drove their shiny new SUVs. Upon reflection, and especially while writing this particular Peoplehood paper, I realized how important partnership and humility are within this whole international development and human rights world, and frankly, within myself. So I left Dili, and I went from being one of 5 Jews in the entire country to spending the next year in Israel as a Dorot Fellow. There's this other snapshot in my head, one that I just can't forget. I was walking in the Tayelet, the promenade in Tel Aviv, many of you know well, and one of the fellows in my group, they said, Lilach, your Jewish identity is so core to you, as is your work in global human rights. Why aren't you working at AJWS? Honestly, I had never heard of that particular alphabet soup of letters. American Jewish World Service, AJWS, is inspired by the Jewish commitment to justice, and we work to realize human rights and end poverty in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. I intentionally say we. I emphasize the partnership, the chavruta aspect of this all. We work with more than 500 grassrooted organizations in countries around the world. And I have the privilege of working with my team and together with top rabbis, cantors, and donors to do further advocacy work here with our US government as it relates to our work in the global South or the developing world. And for the past decade, I've had the true privilege of continuously learning and practicing humility, learning from leaders in the field, such as Jocelyn, a Guatemalan human rights lawyer who is fighting national level cases to allow indigenous people to own and access their land. Or from our grantee partner, Nuevo Horizonte. They come from the northern highlands of Guatemala, and they constantly shed light on what it's like to be an indigenous woman who not only has to fight for their own rights, but to teach others constantly how to do so. As I think back to my 18-year-old self, there I was, listening to the role of the US government around the world. I was listening cognitively, and yet emotionally within me, I was feeling the incredible pull of my own Jewish values and identity. I'm thankful that AJWS has been my home for this work for the past decade. And I know taking global responsibility is necessary. It's necessary for the future of our planet and its inhabitants. And frankly, it's an essential part of what it means to be a Jewish people in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lilach, for those inspiring words. Next on our virtual stage, Cindy Greenberg, President and CEO of Repair the World. In her current position, Cindy's mission is to mobilize Jews and their communities to take action to pursue a just world and make a lifelong commitment to serve. Her essay in the Peoplehood Papers is entitled Tikkun Olam, an American Model for Unity. And now the mic is yours, Cindy.
Thank you so much, Amy, and that was so beautiful, Lilach. So about an hour ago, when I probably should have been preparing and practicing this story, a message came in over Slack. I don't know how many of you work on Slack, but it's this constant barrage of messages amongst my team during the day. And up came a list of reflections from our summer corps participants who this week spent 10 weeks volunteering in their communities in response to the pandemic. And one of the quotes from a participant said, I feel a lot more proud to be a Jew right now, probably the proudest I have ever felt in my life. I feel a lot more proud to be a Jew, probably the proudest I felt in my life. And I, of course, burst out into tears. And it's definitely not the first time that I've cried at work this year. So let's go back in time a little bit to last year, late spring of 2020. I'm sure like many of us, was totally exhausted. We had been in lockdown for a couple of months already. And I have 3 kids at home who were all adjusting to Zoom school. And for some reason, my family also decided, on top of it all, to get a puppy, a spunky little golden retriever mix who's adorable. We love her. But it was an exhausting time. And of course, as someone, running a major Jewish service organization, we had already made many huge pivots, right? We needed to figure out how to keep our fellows safe. We needed to assess the needs of our community partners and see how we can be most of service. And we had begun the process of really starting to identify safe ways to volunteer, both in person and virtually. So picture me, I'm hiding in my basement, away from the kids and away from the puppy, to take a call with one of our biggest funders. And I get on the phone with her, and she said to me, "Cindy, this is the moment that Repair the World was made for. Put out a big vision," she told me. And something inside me just switched. And I understood that leadership in this moment was not just about getting through a crisis, but that it was really about seeing the opportunity for the Jewish community to take action. It was time for the Jewish community to live our values and to care for our most vulnerable neighbors, right? We know that's the mitzvah that's most repeated in our Torah. 36 times we're told to care for the stranger. Now, I know Gen Z very well and have read the same research that you all have, and we know that they are the most civically engaged generation alive. They're so inspiring. And they'd had their plans disrupted. Many of them had their summer plans canceled. They weren't sure if they were going to be going back to school in the fall. And I knew that they would want to make a difference. And we had an opportunity that we could really launch a major response to engage young Jews in meaningful service and Jewish learning in response to the pandemic. I had this feeling that I wanted to be able at the end of the pandemic to look back at that period and to be able to say that we as a community really lived our values. And I was also really scared and really nervous. We'd need to start putting the program together before we'd raised all of the money, which of course is a financial risk. And it seemed to me like an obscene amount of money to raise, especially given the economic downturn. And we'd need to put together a huge new initiative in about 6 weeks all over the country. So it was way out of my comfort zone in terms of the risk that was involved. And yet, as a team, we decided to move forward despite the risk because we knew that we could make an impact, both on our volunteers and in the communities in which they serve. And once we started talking about it, we just couldn't stop. We really built out an unprecedented coalition that began to form. And I honestly, that summer, could not take the calls fast enough. So that by late spring and early into the summer, I was sitting in that basement on Zoom, puppy barking, kids interrupting, hiring staff, building partnerships, poring over budgets, launching a website, working on program design and Jewish learning, and everything that goes with it. And during those weeks, we were able to expand into 5 new cities and raise the money that we needed. And we created a coalition of 40 organizations in the Jewish community who all committed to making service a priority in the coming year. And by July, we were welcoming a pilot cohort of core members across the country, and each of them committed to 10 weeks of service and learning. And by the end of this year, we'll have had 600 core members who will have catalyzed over 100,000 acts of service and learning. Can you hear the noise behind me? There's kids, there's doorbell, there's barking. So these 600 core members will have inspired 100,000 acts of service and learning. And of course, like all good Jewish professionals, we hired an evaluator who told us what I would imagine most of you who are on this call really already know. First is that service can be an essential Jewish act, that it serves as a powerful building block for Jewish engagement and identity, that it builds bridges across lines of difference, both between Jews and also with our neighbors, that it provides a sense of purpose and boosts mental health in a time when that is so needed. And it does all of this while also meeting real social needs. 100% of our service partners have actually reported that we've significantly contributed to their capacity to meet needs in this pandemic time. So I've really come to believe that this initiative, which we've called Serve the Moment, can serve as a powerful model for the future of global Jewish peoplehood. We may pray differently, we may vote differently, we might speak different languages, but as Jews, we're all committed to making the world a better place and to caring for our most vulnerable neighbors. And it turns out what I thought was a risk last summer was really no risk at all. I really believe that the safest bet for those of us who care about the Jewish future is an investment in Jewish service. I too feel a lot more proud to be a Jew right now, probably the proudest that I have ever felt in my life.
Thank you so much, Cindy. And I appreciate you pulling back the curtains on what life is like right now and being the CEO of such a tremendous organization. I want to ask that we take a pause and all of those in our audience, put a one word response to the vignettes and stories you've heard so far. And make sure when you're doing that in chat that you're selecting panelists and participants so it can be broadcasted to everyone. While you're doing that, I'm going to go on to our next story. Jacob Satzman is the founding director of Gabriel Project Mumbai, a development organization providing nutrition, education, healthcare, and economic empowerment to underserved urban slums and villages in India. His essay is entitled Responsible Tikkun Olam. Jacob, my friend, the mic is yours.
Hi, everyone. For the 10 years that Gabriel Project Mumbai has been working with communities living in urban slums and underserved villages, I have been struggling with the concept of Tikkun Olam, fixing the world. And with more than 300 volunteers from around the world, mostly Jewish volunteers who help the organization in many ways, the idea of the role of the Jewish people to play in doing Tikkun Olam added an extra level to the struggle I had with Tikkun Olam and Jewish peoplehood identity. You may ask, what is the struggle? What is the problem? Jews want to fix the problems of the world the best way we can to help vulnerable communities. What could be wrong with that? Well, there isn't anything really wrong with that other than the idea that for us to be doing Tikkun Olam as a requirement for our personal Jewish identity, we need to have people suffering, living in many cases in misery for us to come in, fix the problem with the knowledge that we have complied with God's directive to us, and in doing so, solidifying our Jewish identity. In other words, for us to be good Jews, we need people to suffer so we can help them. In my thinking, this is a crappy paradigm. So what is the solution? Well, the closest thing I have come up with over the last 10 years is that we need a revised paradigm totally when it comes to Tikkun Olam. I believe that we increasingly value the Tikkun Olam mission. We must remove the concept of us as the people that are doing Tikkun Olam and them, the beneficiaries of Tikkun Olam. We must work together with local communities and see the community in terms of not only as partners, but as leaders of the work that we're doing. In essence, we need local leadership to be our guides, our teachers in our joint effort to do Tikkun Olam. We no longer need poor people to suffer, but we need community members to work with us on equal footing in the work we're doing. Now we are no longer doing charity, but we're involved in a sacred work of development. We're not part of a joint effort to create impact we are now part of a joint effort to create impact rather than escalating a power dynamic. So with that, how should Tikkun Olam be done? Well, with the complete understanding that only a grassroots joint effort with local leadership and full cooperation and guidance with local community members is real Tikkun Olam with no strings attached. And so now I'd like to tell you two stories that shows that with local leadership and direction, the Tikkun Olam initiative that we undertake can be far more impactful than we previously experienced. In the picture in front of you, you see the slums of Mumbai, a place called Kalva. It's 180,000 people living in a few square miles, and they were getting sick from the water they were drinking that came from bore wells that you see on the left-hand picture. The bore wells are dug 75 meters down and were contaminated with pollutants and fecal matter We came with ideas of how to mitigate the problem. We came with foreign ideas that were great, but inappropriate for the conditions and people living there. It's only after including local community leaders that we all came out with a program that is simple, innovative, and incredibly impactful. As you see in the second picture here, go back one. The second picture in the same, this is how we see the vulnerable community who needs to do Tikkun Olam, struggling to get the water to drink and knowing that they may get ill from contaminated water. After putting local leaders at the head, we now have a thriving, sustaining social enterprise, a local employer in the slums that offers 1,000 families safe drinking water at little or no cost. The other story happened 1.5 years ago in our work in a remote tribal village area in the district of Moncada. Here in this rural farming area, life is hard. Next picture, please. We as an organization came in with ideas to help, which were good, again, but only when we included local leadership in the management and planning of the programs that we jointly came up with. We came with a project that will knock your socks off. Farmers were struggling to survive, and indeed many farmers in the area had committed suicide due to the pangs of extreme poverty their families were experiencing. Our local leadership identified a program where we can help farmers access government grants for their agricultural needs. $25 grant for tomato seeds, a $50 subsidy for organic fertilizer, an $800 loan that would eventually be forgiven by the government for 20 farmers in the community. In 1.5 years, we accessed $500,000 of available government grants for 1,800 farming families that the community just needed help to tap into. No more charity, no more Tikkun Olam for our national identity, but strengthening local leadership to achieve incredible results. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Jacob, and thank you for that paradigm shift as we think of what Tikkun Olam means to us and to others. I love seeing everybody's responses in the chat to your one-word responses: empathy, love, humility, inspiration. And I'd love for you to continue to share in the chat. Share something that's circling around in your head that you're hearing from these stories. Feel free to drop them in the chat, respond to one another as we go on to our next story. Dr. Ana Lucia Lopez Reverado is a Peruvian Chilean American born in Peru and raised in Spain and the United States. She is the founder and executive director of Jutina Eco. Her essay is entitled Applying an Anti-Oppression Lens to Tikkun Olam. It is my pleasure to toss the mic to Ana Lucia.
Tikkun Olam. It's interesting how those two words have become so integral to so many of us and to our Jewish identity. Tikkun Olam has become synonymous with Jewish activism, specifically today in the United States. And for many of us, living out this value is integral to our observance of Judaism and being in Jewish community. However, Tikkun Olam doesn't necessarily mean the same thing to everyone. And at times, I would challenge ourselves to think that Tikkun Olam is often an imitation to the way in which we see charity work from other different communities existing around the world. I say this because as we transition to a new era of activism, I think it's time that we stretch ourselves to really include the application of an anti-oppressive framework if we truly seek to move towards serving others and supporting their liberation and prioritizing justice. In an anti-oppressive framework, we challenge ourselves to critically examine the pervasiveness of systems of oppression. Systems of oppression refer to the historical and organized mistreatment of people via policies and practices within society. Some of you may recognize this as racism, sexism, heterosexism, ableism, ageism, class oppression, and so much more. All of these systems of oppression have become normalized by society, but with an anti-oppressive framework, we are challenging ourselves to recognize the existence of these systems the power imbalances that exist, how we benefit from them, and more consciously and more critically work towards the promotion of change to redress the balance of power. It's interesting that we're thinking about this just as we're heading into Passover, because as we head into a festival that is so much about our own liberation and is so much rooted in the way in which we think about justice, it's important that we also think, can we truly be free if everyone is not free? Disparities take place all around us, and many of us experience them in varying degrees. Despite that daunting realization, I do think things can change. People are capable of healing, and communities are capable of rebuilding. Change, however, doesn't come easy. It requires people who have previously benefited from the hierarchical nature of these systems to recognize their privilege and to commit to interrupting and eradicating structures that prevent all communities from sustaining themselves with dignity. For millennia, Jews have experienced oppression and have also been awarded privilege. It's hard to think that, especially when we enter a festival that is so rooted in suffering and, of course, what it took for us to get out of that place. Without taking away from our own story, I think it's important to realize that we have a lot to learn. We have a lot to listen to continue to listen to if we're really wanting to achieve what we say we want to on a daily basis, which is to repair and which is to heal. While it's important to celebrate our resilience and the achievement of our people, it's also important to recognize that systems of oppression, especially when compounded together, have prevented many communities from self-actualization. Understanding how oppression and hierarchies function and how we benefit from them are the first steps in really deepening our commitment to anti-oppression and Tikkun Olam. Tikkun Olam is a bold statement that requires bold action, especially right now as we're enduring a second year of a global pandemic that has disproportionately affected the health and the finances of communities of color around the world. It is time that we really contemplate difficult questions regarding our roles in upholding unjust systems that create disparities in the first place. As a collective, the global Jewish community has tremendous power to resist the status quo and move towards designing new systems that are rooted in compassion, liberation, and justice. Inevitably, a change in the status quo will affect the way societies function. It will dismantle hierarchical structures that have previously worked in our favor. And thus, we're going to have to be prepared to answer the following questions. What are the ways in which we enjoy power, privilege, and influence? And what are we truly willing to renounce? What are we truly willing to give up in order to pursue Tikkun Olam and equity? As we look towards the future, we have tremendous work ahead of ourselves. It's going to require that we really look inward and address and heal from internalized racism, colorism, sexism, anti-Semitism, and so much more. As a global and multicultural community, we have to challenge ourselves to engage in honest and open communication. We need to be able to listen to members of our community who continue to be at the heels of systems of oppression. The commitment to becoming anti-oppressive is lifelong. The shift in this perspective is not going to be easy. Many will politicize this work. As leaders, we can't lose sight of the opportunity to shape those committed to Tikkun Olam, to also adapt an anti-oppressive mindset that not only enhances our local and global impact, but also fulfills our commitment to living out the Jewish values of kavod, tzedek, teshuvah, and betzel Elohim. In closing, only a steadfast commitment to liberation and justice will lead us to fulfilling the ideal of Tikkun Olam. Because Tikkun Olam is not just about healing or repairing the world, it's about allowing people to heal themselves and for relationships to be repaired. Because right now, there is a lot of distrust among community, and we need to collectively think and listen to what it is that our community who are the most in need, what they need. Social justice doesn't work in a trickle-down system. We must focus on those that are most oppressed if we really want to value liberation and equity for all. Thank you so much.
Wow, Ana Lucia, thank you so much for posing those important, deep questions that we all have to address in order to truly embrace Tikkun Olam and liberation of everyone. Thank you for those powerful, powerful words. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce Diana Ginsberg, CEO of Olam. In her role at Olam, Diana has created a network of over 50 Jewish and Israeli organizations working in international development, humanitarian aid, and global service. and she has put global causes at the forefront of the Jewish community's agenda around the world. Her essay is entitled, "Want More Jews to Care About Global Issues? Make It Personal." And now, Diana, I pass the mic to you.
I had spent over a dozen years working on social justice and environmental causes, but it wasn't until August 2019 when the issue of climate change hit home in a real way. I was lying on my couch reading the weekend edition of the newspaper and chanced upon an article that surveyed Israel's leading scientists and asked them to envision what life would look like in the year 2100 if the world were to experience the expected rise of 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. All of them, I mean all of them, concluded that by the end of the century, Israelis won't be able to exist without full-time air conditioning. Forget hiking Masada, we will not be able to withstand a walk around the block. And this article shook my world. My kids, who you see in this picture, Levi and Eden, are 2 and 4 years old. This picture is taken across the street from our home in Jerusalem. And in the year 2100, they will be in their early 80s. If predictions are correct, they will not be able to walk to the park with their own grandchildren or even to breathe fresh air. This article took what for me had been a pretty distant issue and made it tangible. Climate change was no longer just about the future of the planet, it was about my home and my family. In my work at Olam, I spend a lot of time trying to think about how to make seemingly remote issues like climate change relevant to the Jewish community. We are a network of over 50 Jewish and Israeli organizations working in the fields of global service, international development, and humanitarian aid. And we have a lot of tools in our toolkit to mobilize Jews in support of the world's most vulnerable. But one tool that we are reluctant to use and express a lot of discomfort around is that of Jewish self-interest. Most Jewish social justice organizations, ours included, prefer to use universal moral claims as opposed to talking about how our work stands to benefit the Jewish community. We are rightfully concerned that by focusing on Jewish needs, we are going to ignore the needs of others, or even worse, take advantage of others for our own ends. And while I share those concerns, I think it does us a disservice to ignore Jewish interests entirely. There are many in the Jewish community for whom the safety and well-being of other Jews is their primary concern. I grew up in and identify with the modern Orthodox community, and many of my closest families, friends, and fellow travelers are those who fall into this camp. And if we want them to devote more time and energy to supporting those outside of the Jewish community, then we need to do a better job of demonstrating how Jewish well-being is tied up in the welfare of others. The current pandemic is a great opportunity to do just that. About a year ago, I would venture that most of us felt pretty disconnected from the fact that less than half of the world's population has access to essential health services. Now it's abundantly clear to everybody that no one is safe and healthy until everyone is safe and healthy. And that is a great opportunity for opening up a conversation with those in the Jewish community who until now were not engaged with the pursuit of Tikkun Olam. It's time to mobilize Jewish support for equitable vaccine distribution and strong healthcare systems around the world. I recently heard a talk by Larry Brilliant, an epidemiologist that was credited with helping to eradicate smallpox, who said, "This is one of those moments when doing the right thing, the noble thing, the moral thing is also the most selfish thing." So wherever you situate yourself on the spectrum of particularism versus universalism, now is the time to look outside of our own communities and be part of the larger tapestry of humanity. Their lives depend on it. Our lives depend upon it. In fact, we've never been more interconnected.
Diana, for that reminder that the world is only going to be a better place if we all work hard together and we all recognize that our destiny is all wrapped up together. Before we move on to the next story, please share a question or a thought, something you're grappling with around Tikkun Olam in the chat. Our next story is from Sarah Eisenman. Sarah is the executive director of JDC Entwine. In her role, she is responsible for the overall vision, strategy, and success of Entwine. Sarah's essay is entitled, "The Tikkun Olam Debate is No Debate at All." Without further ado, Sarah, we are excited to hear your story.
During a recent conversation with Jewish lay leaders, I was asked if Jewish mutual responsibility, Arevut, would suffer given the growing trends around Jewish young people and their interest in universal issues or for helping non-Jewish causes. Basically, would Jewish communal life struggle to survive because young people only care about non-Jews? My response? This is a false choice, a false dichotomy. On the surface, this picture that you see in front of you is a picture of young women exploring India, working with children, enjoying what they're doing. But if you look a little deeper, it is a picture of Jewish women leaders, Ethiopian Israeli, Caribbean American, Indian, Serbian, maybe with different narratives, but all sharing a passion for their Jewish identity and the Jewish community. And that very special bond that many of us know about, that special bond between Jewish people that transcends space and time and even geography. And they also share a deep awareness of their role in the world and in the many communities that they're a part of. With our 5,000 service alumni at Entwine, who serve all around the world, but predominantly in Jewish communities around the world, I've come to understand that for them, this question is actually pretty simple to answer. The very simple answer is that I care about people. I care about Jewish people, and I care about other people. I care about building Jewish life and how we as Jews will build better lives for all people. Both truths can be held simultaneously in the hearts and minds of our constituents, and we can't ask them to put aside their belief in repairing the world for another very, very simple reason. And I'm saying this from, some personal experience. The Jewish family of today and tomorrow already reflects that truth. As one of our service alumni told me, I'm fine if your priority is helping vulnerable Jews, but I can't be involved if you refuse to help other people because they could in theory be my family. Just as she was speaking a very, very simple truth, this is a very simple truth for many, many people, especially in America, but not exclusively. The majority of American Jews today marry people who aren't Jewish, and their families are very diverse. And when we dismiss Tikkun Olam, we might be dismissing their family. The Jewish public of the future will very likely validate our need to build Jewish community, to build flourishing communities all over the world and ensure that this continues. But we will need to take the leap and embrace the full reality of their lives, and that all parts of their identity belong, all parts of their family belong, and not just the very few that we are comfortable with. We will have to go beyond the lip service to be real partners in advancing righteous pursuits to create a more equitable and just society. And not be afraid that somehow by doing this, we're going to diminish our own institutions. I would argue that it's quite the contrary, just the opposite. And finally, the next picture. This brings me to a beautiful synagogue in India with young people, Jewish, not Jewish, American, not American, white, not white, all having served together throughout India and coming together to celebrate the start of Shabbat and enter a day of rest and do that together. They are telling us something very bold, that Jewish confidence does not mean Jewish isolationism. We have been witness to at least two great moments of Jewish exceptionalism. chosenness at Sinai, and the establishment of the State of Israel. If we reflect on where we are today, we'll see that what we have and what we've fulfilled is really a dream. We've built a Jewish state and a refuge with all its complexities and challenges, and we've helped support and create beautiful Jewish communities all around the world. So what comes next for us? I believe that Tikkun Olam is that third opportunity for exceptionalism. Or as Rabbi Sachs wrote, that we've been left with a third promise as the next challenge to perfect the world under the sovereignty of God. For young people and their families and their communities, Jewish identity cannot be a world of us versus them or a life divided between and or, because it never was. This picture, the sisterhood, the love, allyship, community, and strength is who we are and who we can become.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Wow. It's a good reminder that caring for ourselves and caring for others does not have to be mutually exclusive, and what the family, the community of the Jewish people can do when we're in partnership with others. And now to Peter Geffen. Peter is the founder and president of the Kivunim Institute and founder of the Abraham Joshua Heschel School in New York City. He has been a social activist since his service as a civil rights worker for Dr. Martin Luther King in the 1960s. Peter's essay is entitled, "What is Tikkun Olam Anyway?" And now for Peter's story. The mic is yours.
Thanks, Amy. It's quite humbling, actually, to be an old man like me and be in a remarkable crowd of one more impressive person than the next. I'm really sort of sitting here quite stunned. And I want to do two things in my few minutes to talk with you. The first is really to take you back into my own history, which is clearly very different than most of those that we've heard up until now. My youth was a moment in which I was privileged to be taught and inspired by Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel and by Dr. Martin Luther King. And in this picture that's up in front of you, I'm the guy on the right. I may not look like him, but that's me. The guy in the middle was then Mickey Schur of Detroit, Michigan, and is now Rabbi Moshe Schur, a retired Orthodox rabbi, and of course, Dr. King. And without going into the details of the story, that picture was signed by Dr. King in person when he wrote on it, "Best wishes and thanks for your help," and signed his name. For many years, I thought he wrote that to me and to Mickey and to the other civil rights workers who served his organization in the summers of 1965 and 66 throughout the South, which we did. But one year I realized that actually he wrote that to the whole future. Best wishes and thanks for your help also aims at everyone, and in particular today, listening to my colleagues on this call, it is a statement that Dr. King really directed at you. Best wishes and thanks for your help, because he knew that in the future there would be generations of people who would stand for the principles that he did. The anecdote I want to tell you took place at Dr. King's funeral, when Mickey and I were given the privilege of accompanying Rabbi Heschel through the streets of Atlanta, following behind the coffin of Dr. King as he went. The coffin went from the Ebenezer Baptist Church funeral to his original burial place on the campus of Morehouse College. We were young. We had already lost John Kennedy as the President of the United States, who had inspired us in many different ways. Now King was assassinated and killed, and I was 22 years old. I threw up my hands in the air at some point and said, "Rabbi Heschel, what are we to do now?" It felt like the world was ending. And he kept walking, as was often the case. He didn't answer questions like that right away. And then he turned around and he pointed his finger and he said, "You must teach the children. You must teach them a Judaism that can remake the world." And then he turned around and kept walking. And I was 22 years old. I forgot what he said almost immediately. And then 20 years later about 30 years later, on one of the anniversaries of his death at the Heschel School in New York, I had a flashback to this scene. And of course, I wouldn't claim that I have done what he said, but I've certainly attempted to do what he said. which then leads to the topic that I took in my presentation in this wonderful collection of essays. I offered a caution that the use of the term Tikkun Olam and translating that term as repair the world, and then suggesting, as is today the case, as I'm sure you know, that Tikkun Olam doesn't only refer to the extraordinary projects that we are hearing about today, but it also refers to projects for a bar bat mitzvah, once or twice a year, series of events in a school or in a synagogue or congregation or in a JCC. And I offered the caution that we be careful about the use of this terminology, which is really grand, Tikkun Olam, that allows it to refer to individual, not insignificant acts, but they are not really acts of repair the world, of Tikkun Olam. So one suggestion I offered was that maybe we should modify the term in certain cases to repairing the world, the process, rather than an act that a student can say, I just went to my Tikkun Olam project, as if somehow what we do in a moment like that finishes off the task. But the second caution is that if we're going to refer to our acts as Tikkun Olam, using this terminology which comes from our tradition, it seems to me, and this is my educational piece that has been my life's work, and that certainly comes from the mandate that I received both from Heschel and from Dr. King, is that we have to be really well educated. And on the Jewish side of this, there's a danger that we produce a growing generation of people who are wonderfully dedicated to the vital work of social justice in the world, but who actually do not know anything about the Jewish tradition and its relationship. And more specifically, what I would say is this: we possess the body of literature in the Hebrew prophets that is the exemplar of the language and vision and image that the Jewish people has had about what must be done, the things that must be addressed in the world in which we live. And all of you who spoke before me so magnificently addressed all those issues. We call them by all kinds of different names, but those basic issues of the fundamental rights of all people, to the basics of all rights, to a basic sense of equality, justice, and peace, those are the critical elements that we should be working towards into our future. My hope is that a caution with the term Tikkun Olam would force us to be more and more engaged in this kind of work, rooted in, based in, developing understandings from the wealth of our extraordinary philosophy and tradition. And frankly, of course, right before Pesach, of our religious tradition. And then our ability to universalize, to engage the problems that everybody faces as our own and as theirs, is rooted in something that is really substantial. And our use of the terminology will be much more to the point, much more secure, and much more focused on the future. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. A reminder of our call in the world and what it truly means to make a difference. Last, but certainly not least, Rabbi Ethan Prosnet. He is the senior rabbi at Temple Emmanuel in Westfield, New Jersey. He is passionate about pursuing social justice and making connections with global Jewry. His essay is entitled A Reform Rabbi's Reflection on Strengthening Peoplehood Through Tikkun Olam. Start locally and collaborate. And now the stage is yours, Ethan. So we can't wait to hear your story.
Kazakhstan sealed the deal. That is how I started my HUC JIR Rabbinical School application. I was co-leading a trip with JDC Entwine and Tufts University. And during my experience in Almaty, Kazakhstan, I observed a burgeoning Jewish community and saw the excitement of Kazakhstani Jewish students as they yearned to know more about their Jewish faith. I was inspired by their energy, I was inspired by their interest to learn about their Jewish life. And that inspired me to become a rabbi. On my many trips to different Jewish communities around the world during my rabbinical school training, I was confronted that world Jewry is in desperate need of connections. The Jewish world abroad, as well as the Jewish community in the United States, is strengthened by the concept of a greater Jewish people. And one way to do that is through acts of Tikkun Olam. I saw this as I worked side by side with Jews in Argentina building a new Jewish day school, or in Mivet Zion working with Ethiopian Jewish communities at an absorption center, or with Jews in Kazakhstan helping a chesed client, or with Jews volunteering in Rwanda at the Agahoza Shalom Youth Village. Acts of Tikkun Olam can unify us as Jews. Now, 11 years later, as I lead a large suburban congregation 22 miles outside of New York City, I still believe in global Jewish people. And I still believe that Tikkun Olam has the opportunity to bring us together. But what I've realized is that I need to do this work locally to help us build this concept of Klal Yisrael. I was reminded of this recently when I was volunteering with my confirmation class at Jewish Family Services of Central New Jersey. We were working in their community garden and we were picking lettuce and peppers and squash blossoms for their Kosher Meals on Wheels program. It was such a rewarding experience. I could see the smiles behind the mask of my confirmands, and I saw the abundance of the food we had picked. At the end of the volunteer experience, one of my confirmation students comes up to me and says, "Hey, Rabbi, I didn't know there were Jews in our community that needed food. I didn't know that there were Jews in my community that needed food. I knew there were Jews in Israel and around the world, but not here in New Jersey." And this student had been a committed part of our learning community, had volunteered at numerous events. And yet, she did not know that there were agencies in our own backyard helping the Jews in our neighborhoods just right down the street. I had not done my work. For her and so many others, there is a disconnect between the Jewish value of Tikkun Olam and Klal Yisrael. She's worked at the Newark food pantry. She's volunteered with Syrian refugees in our synagogue. But she never saw Tikkun Olam and Klal Yisrael together. Partnering with JFS of Central New Jersey has been an impactful experience for me, for my confirmation class, and for our congregation as we build strong connections and meaningful relationships with other Jews of varying observances. Students have engaged with Holocaust survivors who are homebound. They have shopped and delivered food to Jewish seniors who were in need of their next meal. Through this partnership with JFS, our students now have a greater awareness of the needs of Jews in our local community and their obligation to help. This has strengthened a sense of peoplehood as relationships have been strengthened and fostered. Klal Yisrael needs to be grown locally too. My hope is that in the future, I'll have a former confirmation student write on their rabbinical school application, volunteering at JFS in my own backyard sealed the deal.
Thank you, Ethan. I hope that many, many of your students become the leaders of our community in the future. I now want to invite all of our speakers to turn on their videos so we can see all of your faces. And I know on behalf of myself and the audience, I'm walking away with chills and inspiration. Thank you for all of your leadership, for your humility, for your activism. And I know that with all of you at the helm, the Jewish people and the world will be strengthened. Thank you all so very much. And to our audience, thank you for your participation, for sharing your thoughts in the chat. And you can learn more from these extraordinary leaders in the Peoplehood Papers. The link is posted in the chat, or you can simply Google it as well. I wish everyone a Chag Sameach. May this Passover bring us liberation, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. And I appreciate all of you joining us here today. Thank you so much.